Well, turns out exactly what we expected to happen did happen. And I'll be honest, I think Ronald Curry made the right choice heading to Buffalo. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, Ross Jackson, your New Orleans native, New Orleans Saints expert, and credentialed media member covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to be taking a look at some of the free agents that are out there with connective tissue to the Kyle Shanahan offense and how they could be good fits for the New Orleans Saints once free agency opens up in a little over a month from now. We're also going to be taking a look at Jaan Jennings and some of the San Francisco 49ers free agents or pending free agents that you can watch this Sunday during the Super Bowl. We're going to kick everything off today, though, with a quick look at Ronald Curry, departing from the New Orleans Saints, headed over to the Buffalo Bills. I'm going to explain to you why it was the right choice for Ronald Curry, and it's going to be okay for the New Orleans Saints. Appreciate you, as always, for being an everydayer and making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at Prize Picks, our very last crossover Thursday here on the network. It's Muses Thursday as well, shout out. But our very last crossover Thursday here on the network with Locked On 49ers and Locked On Chiefs. So if you're interested and want to check them out for the Super Bowl game, please go and check them out on either one of those channels as they break it all down. Prize Picks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Head over to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. Promo code in all lowercase Locked On NFL for our first deposit match up to $100. So look, former now quarterback coach and passing game coordinator for the New Orleans Saints, Ronald Curry, made the right choice heading over to Buffalo to become their next quarterback coach. On Wednesday's show, and I know I'm getting this Thursday show out on Thursday. Sorry, I've been trying to do everything, early, night before, all that other stuff, but just didn't work out today, so I apologize for that. But getting that opportunity, or rather, Wednesday. See, I talk too much. Wednesday on the show, we were kind of breaking down why I thought Ronald Curry would be justified in heading elsewhere and why that's what I expect. Well, before that show even really got rolling, the news came out that he was indeed leaving, that he wouldn't be returning. And then later on, the news broke that he was going to be headed to the Buffalo Bills to be their new quarterback coach. Remember, he and Joe Brady, who's now the Buffalo Bills offensive coordinator, they both overlapped here in New Orleans. Ronald Curry made the right choice making that move. And again, I don't think that it's about, just like I said on yesterday's episode, I don't think that it's about bad blood or being, ticked off with the Saints or anything like that. It's just, look, there was an opportunity for advancement within the organization. You chose somebody else for that advance or for that position. Therefore, I don't get the opportunity for advancement. I'm going to go spread my wings and see what's available to me elsewhere because I think I'm done climbing the ladder here. I don't think that there's a space for me to continue to move up. Had a good run. I'm off somewhere else now. And in case anybody's wondering, because I know that this question usually comes up whenever there are minority coaches that get jobs elsewhere, this is not a situation in which the Saints get awarded with any kind of draft pick compensation or anything like that, nor is that the important part of this story. The important part of this story is that the Saints now have an open quarterback coach spot and an open passing game coordinator spot. And Ronald Curry, a guy that's been here in New Orleans for a long time, has now departed. And now your, longest tenured staff member outside of Dennis Allen is Brian Young, your pass rush specialist over on the defensive side. And so that's a pretty big impact. I will say, and big shout out to Catherine Terrell over at ESPN for putting this out, but the Saints did offer Ronald Curry the wide receiver coach spot to stay here in New Orleans. And Ronald Curry, I think, made the right choice, declined that, and stayed in the quarterback game heading over to Buffalo. And that's the right choice when advancement is your priority. And clearly advancement is and should be the priority for Ronald Curry and for any coach in the NFL. Here's the kind of dirty little secret of the hierarchy of offensive coaching. And not every organization is the same. Not every situation is the same. This is just a generalization from what I've picked up from having conversations with trusted people within the combine and at the draft and at Super Bowls and stuff like that, and having conversations with coaches, not specifically within the New Orleans Saints organization, but just people that coach in the NFL, people that coach in college or are looking to advance into coaching in college or looking to advance into coaching in the NFL, that if you're on the offensive side, your path to becoming your path to becoming a head coach in the NFL goes quarterback coach, passing game coordinators in there, depending upon where it's relevant. Like some teams have it, some teams don't. Some teams use pass game specialists, blah, 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 right? Your trajectory to head coach on the offensive side of the football is most directly, generally speaking, okay, there's exceptions, quarterback coach, passing game coordinator could sometimes get mixed in there, offensive coordinator, head coach. That's the trajectory, generally speaking. Making that leap from wide receiver coach to offensive coordinator is a larger leap than making the leap from quarterback coach to offensive coordinator. There's a lot of different things that go with that. When you've got the passing game coordination experience, you have a little bit of the play design experience, maybe even a little bit of the play calling experience that comes with that, understanding the when and why to make certain play calls and to use certain schemes or use certain approaches or certain philosophies, XYZ. When you're a quarterback coach, you're working with the person that touches the football every single play. That translates very well to calling plays for the guy that touches the football every single play. You get what I'm saying? There's a connection there in terms of how the game is called, how the game is seen, how the game is utilized, all that. Doing that from a wide receiver coach is possible. And there are very good wide receiver coaches in the league, in college, in high schools, wherever, that are coaching and do a phenomenal job that can be offensive coordinators. Look at Brian Hartline over with the Ohio State Buckeyes, okay? Went from wide receiver coach to offensive coordinator. So I highlight that as a means of expressing why making the decision to stick with the quarterback coach tag and continue to work with the quarterback coach or continue to work with quarterbacks was the right decision for Ronald Curry, even though it led him out of the city of New Orleans. Now, the Saints are going to be okay here. I'm not going to downplay Ronald Curry's importance. Ronald Curry was extremely important to this team. Everyone loved him. Everybody loved working with him. Derek Carr loved working with him. All those things matter. The Saints are going to be able to find somebody to come in, whether it's Klint Kubiak's younger brother, Klay Kubiak, whether it's Brian Griese, who they also interviewed for the offensive coordinator spot. They can technically offer him additional responsibilities here in New Orleans because of the passing game coordinator tag, stuff like that. So they'll find somebody. They'll be okay when it comes to all that. But the thing that I think is best here, or that is right here, is that the Saints and Ronald Curry saw, okay, we're heading in different directions on the offensive side. They've effectively they have cleaned out their offensive coaching staff. So go and get your opportunity somewhere else. And that's what RC did. And I think that was the right choice. And he gets to work with Josh Allen, which is going to even further put him on the map, all those things. So I don't think this was a bad thing for the New Orleans Saints. I don't think that this was a bad thing for Ronald Curry. Sometimes things just come to an end. This seemed like this was a clean breaking point for all of that, and the right decision was made for the Saints, and the right decision was made by Ronald Curry. So nothing but continued success, hoping for nothing but continued success for Ronald Curry as he continues to climb the ladder or whatever in the NFL. And maybe, just maybe, we'll see him back in New Orleans in a different capacity years down the road. Coming up next, Jaan Jennings, wide receiver for the San Francisco 49ers, would be a perfect fit for the New Orleans Saints in this year's free agency, especially with Klint Kubiak expected to be the offensive coordinator. But are there other San Francisco 49ers free agents that should be on your radar this weekend while you're watching the Super Bowl? Let's break it all down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at Nissan. Are you somebody that likes to take things just a little bit further? You always want to know what your next adventure is right around the next corner. Well, Nissan's got the perfect lineup of SUVs to help you take all of your adventures to the next level. Let's start off with the Alvin Kamara of it all, the Nissan Rogue. It's perfect for city drives and great escapes, perfectly versatile, just like Alvin Kamara is. 2024 is also the perfect mid-size, or the 2024 Rogue, rather, is also the perfect mid-size crossover for your next adventure. Maybe you want the offensive line to lead your family on your way to success in your next adventure. Well, that's where you go and check out the 2024 Nissan Armada. Seats up to 8 in first-class luxury style. Everything that you expect from a full-size SUV will change once you take a seat in that Armada. So take the Nissan Rogue, the Nissan Pathfinder, or the Nissan Armada to find your next big adventure. Shop today at nissanusa.com. All right, family. San Francisco 49ers wide receiver Jaan Jennings could be the perfect fit or a perfect fit for the New Orleans Saints in this year's free agency. We're going to take a look at a couple of other San Francisco 49ers you could watch this weekend during the Super Bowl that could potentially fit for the Saints. Appreciate you as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 national sports stream, the first of its kind, over on YouTube. Our local experts, our national experts covering every league, all the top stories from around sports. They're waiting for you over at Locked On Sports Today, which you can find that 24/7 national sports stream, the first of its kind over on YouTube. So I want to start this off with a look at Jaan Jennings in particular, but we're going to take a look at a couple of different San Francisco 49ers, but I'm going to focus mostly on wide receiver Jaan Jennings and why he could be a perfect fit for the New Orleans Saints with their incoming scheme. With Klint Kubiak, the San Francisco 49ers passing game specialist, expected to become the New Orleans Saints offensive coordinator. We highlighted why I don't think you have to be too worried about, anybody like about facing on all this and maybe turning back and going another way or anything in yesterday's episode. So now we're starting to look at these free agents that could potentially fit the system that would travel with Klint Kubiak. And it's important to mention that it's not just the Shanahan system that's coming with Kubiak. There's a Kubiak system that comes with Kubiak as well. So it's a little bit of a blend of a couple of those things. But it is the Shanahan of it all, the wide zone of it all, that's most exciting. It's taking your offense to the next level, taking your offense into the next plane in 2024, which is good. Everyone should be excited about that. But when it comes to what this wide zone concept brings to the New Orleans Saints, it means a lot of outside runs, a lot of runs outside of the tackles and things like that. So a guy like Jaan Jennings makes a lot of sense. Here's why. 6'3", 215 pounds, big-bodied guy. Remember the Saint? Well, I'll get to that in a moment. Ross, why are you so excited about a guy who had 19 catches, 265 receiving yards, and 1 touchdown catch last year? And in 2022 had 35 catches, 416 yards, and 1 touchdown. It's because it's not just about what he does as a receiver. In fact, I'm not even really all that stoked about the idea of this wide receiver as a receiver. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, Ross, that doesn't make any sense at all. And while I understand that, we have to remember that the wide receiver position, believe it or not, is more than running routes and catching footballs. There's the blocking aspect, there's the protection aspect, there's the design aspect, there's the disguise aspect. There's so many different things that you do as a wide receiver. And even if you go back and you take a look at just last year where you had the combination of like Lynn Bowden as well as Keith Kirkwood, those guys combined for 13 catches for 120 yards and a touchdown. And the most receiving yards were 83 out of that pair. So comparing 19 catches, 265 receiving yards and a touchdown doesn't look so bad anymore now, does it? Now, the thing to remember here is that for the San Francisco 49ers in 2023, by target, when it comes to the wide receivers, Deebo Samuel was number 1, Brandon Ayuk was number 2, and then Jaan Jennings was number 3. But of course, above Jaan Jennings were also Christian McCaffrey as well as George Kittle. So you're talking about him being like the 5th most targeted guy, maybe, on the team. In 2024, what's your wide receiver lineup? It's Chris Olave, it's Rashid Shaheed, it's A.T. Perry. And then you certainly expect Alvin Kamara to get more targets than what a Jaan Jennings would get. And I would expect all 3 of those receivers to get more targets in the passing game than a Jaan Jennings. And then you have, Juwan Johnson could potentially end up with more receptions there as well. Maybe Foster Rowe, maybe some other tight end. We'll see. But it's the blocking ability to me that's the biggest selling point. We're talking about, this is where I started to get a little bit ahead of myself. But if the Saints are implementing this wide zone offense, what that means is a lot of those outside runs, running outside the tackles. When you do that a lot, you have to have good perimeter blocking. And sometimes you can get that perimeter blocking by splitting a tight end out into the slot, even splitting a tight end out wide if you want to. But if you think back to when Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram were their most impressive and their most productive, you had guys like Michael Thomas on the perimeter, who was an outstanding perimeter blocker. Traquan Smith, I know, I evoked the name. How dare I? He, perimeter blocker, was outstanding in that role. Ted Ginn Jr., as small as he was in terms of his frame, was actually a pretty effective run blocker over on the perimeter. Those things matter. They're not sexy. They're not stats. They're not going to get you paid. Jaan Jennings would be a mid-tier free agent signing contract in terms of value, probably at the most, unless San Francisco overpays to keep him in San Francisco, which he's vital enough to that scheme that could make sense. John Hendricks and I, my buddy over at Saints News Network, were kind of going back, not really going back and forth. He quote tweeted something. I replied to that tweet. And he quote tweeted or reposted whatever, a video of Jaan Jennings like blocking somebody out the club, like taking it on the Green Bay Packers, taking them all the way out to the sideline, all those other things. And it was like, okay, great. Like, this is the type of guy that I could see the New Orleans Saints pursuing and going after in this year's free agency class, because I don't expect they're going to make any big splashes. And if they do, maybe it's one, and it's some unexpected signing more than it is like a high level, top level contract signing. Like, it would be that kind of a thing. But this would be the type of guy that makes sense. And so wide receivers blocking downfield greater than season is back in that case, right? So that's the reason why I think that Juwan Johnson would be a really, really good fit. So you see a lot of the outside zone runs, getting outside the tackles, all that. Let's define that a little bit. So the San Francisco 49ers in 2023, 41% of their rushes went to the ends. So outside of the tackle. That was tied for the sixth highest percentage in the NFL. And there were a bunch of others that are tied up at the top there. So San Francisco technically falls at like number 9, but in terms of the highest percentage numbers, 41% was the sixth highest. So just outside the top 5. They do this a lot. Expect that to come to New Orleans. You also saw, going beyond just what you can do with a Jaan Jennings in the blocking area, you also expect a guy that's 6'3", 215 pounds to be able to go and make some tough catches for you over the middle of the field. Another thing that Traquan Smith didn't do consistently enough to get credit on. It's not that I don't think that he got it's not that I think he didn't get the credit that he deserved in that area of the game. I just don't think he did it consistently enough for anyone to really give him that credit. Jaan Jennings, a little bit more consistent there. And the San Francisco 49ers offense, which a large piece of that is traveling with Klint Kubiak, assuming that he remains the offensive coordinator as we expect. 24% of their targets went to the middle of the field in the passing game. That was the third most in the NFL. Third most in the NFL. And they were not far off. I think second place was 25%. First place was 26%. So we're talking 1 percentage boost from being number 2, 2 percentage boost from being number 1. So when you look at a guy like Jaan Jennings, 6'3", 215 pounds, can make those tough catches over the middle, can block out on the perimeter. If he's traveling with this system, it makes a ton of sense. Other San Francisco, and you'll be able to watch him this weekend with the Super Bowl. Other guys that you probably won't see, the San Francisco 49ers don't have a ton of offensive free agents. They have just a bunch, I almost said something else, a bunch of defensive free agents. But a couple of other guys that could potentially make sense. Center John Feliciano, who's played a lot of football, could be one of those guys that you bring in as a center to kind of help translate the game for the offensive line for training camp. Maybe becomes like a veteran practice squad guy or something like that. The Saints, for whatever reason, do not like having multiple centers on their active roster. I don't understand it. I will never understand it. But John Feliciano may be one of those guys that's a veteran offensive lineman that comes in, helps out a bit during training camp. And then there's quarterback Sam Darnold. Look, I don't know if Jameis Winston's going to be back. I take a lot of flack for this because I'm in the minority on this situation, but I do think he should be back because it would be a good display of leadership from the organization. Leadership by the, how do I want to say this? Leadership by virtue of unity, as opposed to leadership by virtue of like cutting ties with guys that did something that you didn't necessarily like. But if Jameis Winston isn't going to be back, which does seem likely, does make sense if that were to happen, Sam Darnold's a guy that's a quarterback. And then there's Brandon Allen too. Like, I'm not even looking at either of these guys. I'm not looking at a Sam Darnold and being like, oh, he'd be a good backup quarterback. Like, I would never want to see Sam Darnold on the field for the New Orleans Saints. No, thank you. Not signing up for that. However, to have somebody that's around to kind of help translate the system a bit for your starting quarterback in Derek Carr, that could make sense. So that could be a Sam Darnold. That could be a Brandon Allen. That could be whomever. It doesn't really matter. It's just, I see the value in some veteran quarterback, if the Saints are looking for one, coming over from that system to help install that system here in New Orleans. It's a pragmatic approach more than it is an approach that will like have an impact on the field because that player is on the field. It's more that approach has an impact on the sideline for the guy that is in the game in Derek Carr. So those are the free agents that are worth paying attention to. Specifically, though, Juwan Johnson this weekend in Sunday's big game. All right, coming up next, let's take a look at some of the non-49er free agents that make sense, including guys that have overlapped with Klint Kubiak in other destinations. Got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood is the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on that 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply now. Let's get to some legal info. Claims as of Q1 2024 validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risks, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of your first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial, LLC, member SIPC, a registered broker-dealer. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. There are more free agents out there that'll make sense for the New Orleans Saints. Of course, we're going to be diving into a bunch of that here as we get closer and closer to free agency opening up, which is sooner than you might think. March 13th, first official day of the league year. But there are some guys that have maybe had some time in San Francisco, had some time with Klint Kubiak elsewhere, or just simply have had time in wide zone schemes, these Shanahan-esque schemes that are sweeping the NFL that could make sense for the New Orleans Saints. Let's take a look at a handful. Appreciate you as always, making Locked On Saints a part of your day. Don't forget, we are your team every day. So we'll be back tomorrow taking a look at the vacancies for the New Orleans Saints coaching staff, recapping some of the big stories from this week as well, for in case you missed it, just to make sure you're all caught up on everything going into the weekend. So let's take a look at some of the places and some of the players that could make sense as non-49er free agent fits, but that maybe have some 49ers ties or at least some scheme ties. So let's start off with one of the newest sort of Shanahan branches of the coaching tree, Mike McDaniel and the Miami Dolphins. There are actually a handful of players that could make sense that are hitting the market that have either spent time with San Francisco, with Klint Kubiak, or just simply in the system. And I want to start off with another wide receiver. And you're going to notice that like wide receivers and tight ends are kind of a trend here. But another wide receiver in Cedric Wilson. Cedric Wilson is one of those like role play wide receivers. He's not the biggest guy. He's not the blocker or anything like that, but he's got good speed. He can go up there and win some contested catches, things like that. I think that like what you would see in a situation like a Cedric Wilson is kind of what you saw with Kiki Kuti or what you saw with Lynn Bowden even during the offseason, where they kind of got brought in. Let's see what you got kind of thing. Like, look, the Saints need wide receivers, like they got 3 on contract, technically 2 on contract, but a third, Rashid Shaheed, is effectively on contract because he's a restricted free agent. So the 2 don't even have to talk to one another and he would be back next season. I think that they will talk to one another because what we've seen with Carl Granderson and Jaan Johnson actually here in New Orleans before is that when you're a restricted free agent and you've had contributions the way that those 2 have, if you've made contributions in the way that Rashid Shaheed has, who is now a Pro Bowler and an All-Pro, by the way, you generally work out a longer standing deal. They did a 2-year deal with Carl Granderson that turned into his larger extension. They did a 2-year deal with Jaan Johnson that can turn into a larger extension after this year. And then we'll see if that's the same route that they go with Rashid Shaheed. But even with that, they need more wide receivers. And so a guy like Cedric Wilson could potentially make some sense. Another guy that makes sense too, Tyler Kroft, 6'6" tight end, 252 pounds. Could be somebody that's a bit of a red zone threat. Didn't really do much at all. Played 8 games in 2023. Didn't register a single stat, but also was in 2022 with the San Francisco 49ers as well, Tyler Kroft. And so he was one of those guys that came out of that really loaded tight end draft that hasn't really landed somewhere where he wasn't behind somebody. He was behind Kittle in San Francisco. He was behind Gesicki in Miami, so on and so forth. So I don't know how much opportunity he's really gotten during all of his times and stuff like that, but certainly could be an option for another big body to add to that tight end room, even if it doesn't work out. Because look, he hasn't impressed a ton. He's only been in the NFL for a handful of years. He's been on like 3 different teams or whatever. but maybe he lands and finds a good role in a place like New Orleans where it's just like, hey, go be big on third down, go be big in the red zone, whatever that might be, and has, again, experience in these types of offenses in San Francisco immediately, but then also in Miami this past season. There's a swing guard there, Robert Jones, and as tempted as I was to put the Louisiana boy, Robert Hunt, on this list, I just don't think that Miami's letting him out of their grasp at all. And that would be a humongous contract, right? Robert Hunt's one of the better guards in the NFL right now and everything. He's done a fantastic job in that very like hyper athletic offensive line over in Miami. Robert Jones is not Robert Hunt, but he's a swing guard that has played a little bit of left guard, a little bit of right guard, kind of does all those things. He just has New Orleans Saints written all over him. He's got several years of experience, all that. He's somebody that could be interesting as somebody that just comes in, even if it's just during camp. Like, I'm not saying that any of these guys end up on the 53-man roster, that any of these guys are, making, playoff winning plays next year, anything like that. These are just guys that could make sense to bring in, get a look at, see how they fit, and maybe help translate the system a little bit in the process. So that's another one that makes sense to me as just kind of like this swing guard guy that can come in and kind of help out on the offensive line throughout the offseason. Let's go to Minnesota. Minnesota is another one that runs a bit more of a wide zone offense. They kind of run the McVay tree there with Kevin O'Connell as the head coach. But I found two guys that are becoming free agents this offseason that spent time with Klint Kubiak in 2021 in Miami. In Minnesota. The first of which is another wide receiver, KJ Osborne. And listen, KJ Osborne, there's a lot of people in the Saints locker room. I don't know about the organization, but there are a ton of people in the Saints locker room that love KJ Osborne. KJ Osborne and Marquez Callaway used to be like very good friends, or still are very, very good friends, stuff like that. And so I assume that there's been some like mutual respect that's built elsewhere within that locker room. Marquez isn't with the Saints anymore, but he was throughout the end of last season, all those things. And I'm sure that there's some mutual respect that's built from there. And all that. He's just a good character dude too. Like, he's just one of those dudes that makes a ton of sense for the New Orleans Saints. Last year, 48 catches, 540 yards, 3 touchdowns. Traquan wishes he could have, you know what I mean? Like, that's a guy that you bring in and say, okay, cool. Like, there's some stuff there. Let's see what you can do. Put you behind, the big 3 guys. Maybe bring in Jaan Jennings as well. KJ Osborne, also a solid blocker, like a really smart player. Go out there and return kicks for you too if you need him to. I mean, the kid could do a little bit of everything. So it could be really interesting opportunity there, yet another wide receiver. And then here's one that I thought was really interesting. So not only did he spend last year in Minnesota working in that wide zone system, but also spent the year before that in Denver with Clint Kingsbury. Oh, man, I'm so glad we don't have to do the Cliff Kingsbury thing. Klint Kubiak and all too. So he was in Denver in 2022. So he would have, yeah. So that's right. So the year before, he was with Klint Kubiak in Denver in 2022. And that's guard Dalton Reisner. Now, Dalton Reisner was a name that, like, Saints fans loved all throughout the offseason last year. Really wanted the Saints to go out and get him. I think they need help on the interior. We don't know what's going to happen with Andrus Peat. And so a guy like Dalton Reisner, who now has experience in the wide zone concept with the Minnesota Vikings, who started, I believe, with the Jaguars, and then also had time with Klint Kubiak in Denver, that maybe there's some connective tissue there that could bring him to New Orleans and then get an opportunity to do that. The time that he spent in Minnesota was fine. It's not going to be anything that's going to, make him a top paid guard or anything like that. So it's not cost prohibitive. Like, it's right in the pocket of where I think the New Orleans Saints should spend their offseason money, or spend their offseason opportunities, spend next year's money, however it is they want to look at it. A guy like Dalton Reisner could make a ton of sense. And then finally, I'm going to Cincinnati, but I'm not going to Cincinnati because of Cincinnati's system. I'm going to Cincinnati because there's a guy there that spent time with Kubiak in Minnesota that I think a lot of Saints fans would actually be pretty excited to see in New Orleans. He's not their typical fit at the position, but what about tight end Irv Smith Jr.? Spent 2021 with Kubiak in Minnesota. Last year was with Cincinnati. He hasn't done a lot to be like a game breaker or anything like that, but he was always one of those guys that felt like, okay, yeah, there's something there that could work. And it's a cool story, right? Irv Smith Jr. following in the footsteps of Irv Smith Sr. playing with the New Orleans Saints. Last year in Cincinnati, he finished the year with 18 receptions, 115 yards, and a touchdown. His best season was 30 receptions for 365 yards and 5 touchdowns in 2020 with Minnesota. The year that he spent with Klint Kubiak, 25 catches, 182 yards, 2 touchdowns, was on his way to a pretty good season, only played 8 games in that year. So maybe, just maybe, there could be some fun in the Irv Smith, New Orleans connection planning around in this one. So those are some other just kind of free agents with some interesting ties. They're not the only free agents that make sense. Yes, there are bigger name free agents and everything like that too, but these are the guys that are kind of like in that mid-level that have connections to Klint Kubiak or the sweeping nature of the wide zone, Kyle Shanahan, gap scheme mix-in concepts that you see all around the NFL right now that the Saints are trying to get in their building. Could be very interesting. So those are just some names to watch. And we'll go over some more, of course, as free agency gets nearer. But tomorrow, we're going to focus on making sure you're all caught up on everything you need to know, including more on the departure of Ronald Curry, more as well on the departure of Kevin Carberry, who I thought could potentially be an offensive line coach for the New Orleans Saints. He's headed elsewhere. We're going to break that down and what else you should expect and could have missed from over the week. Appreciate you as always. Make a Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. NBA trade deadline is going on. Are the New Orleans Pelicans going to trade for anybody? Jake Madison's discussing it over at Locked On Pelicans. The LSU Tigers with the number 7 highest ranked 2024 class in the country, thanks to the work that they did within the state of Louisiana. Caroline Fenton's breaking all that and more down over at Locked On LSU. Appreciate you as always for making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, especially at the parades, say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Raw Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.